My name is Maria Gonzalez, and today I'll be talking about the processes that give rise to landscape patterns. So, first, let's talk about landscape ecology. It's the study of the pattern and interactions between ecosystems within a region of interest and the way the interactions affect ecological processes. Okay, so when we view a landscape, we notice its composition, that is, the types of land cover or communities and their spatial arrangement. The spatial structure of each landscape results from the interactions of various factors, including abiotic, biotic, natural disturbances, and human activities. The distinct patterns of communities that we see in the landscape, as well as the species inhabiting them, are heavily influenced by both past and present natural disturbances. A disturbance, actually, is any relatively discrete event, both physical and biological, that disrupts community structure and function. Disturbances can also come in the form of human activity, as it involves continuous management of an ecosystem. It affects ecosystems more profoundly, actually, than natural disturbances do. One of the more permanent and radical changes can be seen when humans replace natural vegetation and communities with croplands. Another large scale disturbance is timber harvesting. The result of human activities is often resulting in habitat fragmentation. This process not only reduces the availability of habitats for species, but it also fragments populations. A landscape, first of all, is a spatially heterogeneous area composed of patches embedded within a matrix. Landscapes are comprised of three main elements like patches, boundaries, and corridors. Patches are areas that are more or less homogeneous compared to their surroundings. They're the basic unit of landscapes that can change and fluctuate. Boundaries are the place where the edge of one patch meets the edge of another. Corridors are thin strips that connect isolated patches of habitat together. The proximity of patches to each other influences landscape connectivity, which is the availability or the ability for interactions to occur among patches. There's one additional feature that defines the structure of the landscape, and that is the spatial arrangement of the patches, their context within the broader landscape. A landscape is not defined by its size, please note, but by the scale relative to the organism or the process of interest. How we define these elements of the landscape, however, is dependent on the organism or process that is being examined. Like I said, an example of this, you could consider the forest landscape in eastern North America, for example, in which patches of grassland habitat are embedded within the forest matrix. To the meadow vole, which is a species of small mammal that inhabits these old field environments, the landscape represents patches of potential grassland habitat separated by forest that present a barrier to movement between patches. Each patch might support a local population, with dispersal among populations influenced by the proximity of patches and the existence of corridors that facilitate movement or connectivity. But if we think about a smaller animal, for example, like a milkweed bug, which lives, feeds, and reproduces on individuals of common milkweed plant, each patch of grassland habitat might function as a whole landscape, and each milkweed plant or patch of milkweed plants might support a local population of milkweed bugs. So again, a landscape is not defined by its size, but it is defined by the scale relative to the organism or process of interest.
As explained earlier, boundary is an area of transition between patches. Some boundaries indicate an abrupt change in physical conditions. It could be topography, substrate, soil type, or microclimate. For example, in this picture, the boundary between the terrestrial and aquatic environment is where abrupt changes in the physical environment give rise to changes in community structure. These boundaries are usually stable and often permanent features of the landscape. Other boundaries, however, like this one, is a result from natural disturbances such as natural disaster or from human-related activities like this agricultural land. These boundaries are typically transient and subject to successional changes over time. So that means that boundaries are dynamic, changing in space and time. Some boundaries between landscape patches are narrow and abrupt. Other boundaries are much bigger, forming a transition zone called ecotone between the adjoining patches. This one is an ecotone. Environmental conditions in this transition zone between patches enable certain plant and animal species to colonize boundary environments. Boundaries can also restrict or facilitate dispersal of seeds and movements of animals across the landscape. Thus, boundaries offer unique habitats with relatively easy access to adjacent communities. Plant species found in ecotone tend to be more shade intolerant and can tolerate dry conditions. Animal species inhabiting boundary environments usually require two or more habitat types within their home range or territory. On the other hand, if the species are restricted exclusively to the edge environment, they are referred to as the edge species, like this bird. Patch size has a crucial influence on community structure, species diversity, and the presence and absence of species. Large patches of habitat contain a greater number of individuals and species than small patches do. So that means the greater the area, just like this patch, the greater the number of potential home ranges that can be supported within the patch.
Landscape connectivity permits movement between patches. So it is the type, number, and spatial arrangement of patches on the landscape that actually influence the movement of organisms as well as the population dynamics of species and the community structure. So the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of organisms among patches is referred to as landscape connectivity. So there are two components to landscape connectivity, the structural and the functional connectivity. So for the structural, it refers to the physical arrangement of habitat patches that are physically linked to one another. On the other hand, functional connectivity describes the landscape that facilitates the movement of organisms. So the term movement here refers to the physical and the behavioral responses. Therefore, functional connectivity is both landscape and species specific. So one structural feature of the landscape that can facilitate an organism's movement between patches of suitable habitat is a corridor. So corridors are strips of vegetation similar to the patches they connect, but different from the surrounding matrix in which they are set. So corridors also act as filters, providing dispersal routes for some species but not others. So corridors also would provide a filter effect. The theory of island biogeography applies to landscape patches. So the theory of island biogeography was first developed by Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson, wherein it provides a framework to understand how size and connectivity can interact to influence patterns of species richness and patches within the landscape. So in simplest terms, the number of species established on an island represents a dynamic equilibrium between the immigration of new colonizing species and the extinction of previously established ones.
In this portion, we will be discussing more on the metapopulation theory. Metapopulation theory examines the colonization and extinction of the local population of a given species on the array of patches or the potential habitat embedded in a broader landscape. The concept of metapopulation provides framework for examining the dynamics of a species distributed as discrete populations on the larger landscape. Metapopulation dynamics is governed by two sets of processing operating at two distinct spatial scales, the individual patch and the landscape patch. In the individual patch, individuals move and interact with one another in the course of their routine activities. On the other hand, on the landscape, dynamics are governed by the interaction of local population, namely the process of dispersal and colonization. In theory, all local population will be extinct, so the long-term persistence of metapopulation depends on the process of recolonization. When we say colonization, it involves the movement of individuals from occupied patches to unoccupied patches to form new local populations, and it is the key feature of metapopulation. The concept of metapopulation is closely related to the process of turnover in the population, the extinction and establishment of populations. Study of dynamics is essentially the study of the conditions under which these two processes, namely the extinction and establishment of populations, are in balance. According to Levin's model of metapopulation dynamics, it is the fraction of discrete habitat patches represented by P on the landscape occupied at any given time or represented by T. The change of these two variables can be defined as the difference between the rates of colonization and extinction. So Levin's model suggests that each subpopulation in a habitat patch has a fixed extinction probability and that rate at which patch go extinct increases linearly in relation to P. Levin's model makes several assumptions for the sake of mathematical simplicity. First is that all patches are equal in size and quality as habitat, and second is that it assumes each unoccupied patch has an equal probability of being colonized, and the local population inhabiting each occupied patch has an equal probability of extinction. In reality, these assumptions may be unrealistic for naturally occurring metapopulations, in a sense that there are a lot of variations that can be observed in the real setting. Metapopulation persistence depends simultaneously on the patch size and isolation. Isolation decreases the probability of colonization and therefore decreases the rate of patch colonization, or the C. Increasing patch size decreases the probability of extinction and therefore the rate of extinction.
Local community, the set of species inside the patch that are interacting directly together or indirectly. So all of these are considered local communities. Some species of the local community will disperse to other local communities. Now they are all linked together by the dispersal of individuals. So when viewed as a whole, this is termed the meta community. So meta community is just the local communities that are linked together by the dispersal of individuals. The main focus here is that to examine what regulates the coexistence between multiple species in the connected habitat patches. Example, the species composition of a patch will determine the species dispersal of another one. For example, if a predator is the yellow ones here and the blue ones are the prey will not go there or will be relatively in low numbers. So the model of meta-community dynamics explains how interactions inside the meta-community influences the meta-population dynamics. Disturbances in the landscape will give way to the process of succession. So for example, these are all considered patches here. All of them will undergo changes through the process of succession. This is early successional, which turns to mid, then late throughout time. And the shifting mosaics of the state. What that means is that the mosaic is always changing. The mosaic here is always changing throughout time. But the proportion of the patches is in steady state, which means it's fairly constant in all of time. So in sum, the community in these patches is viewed as an island, but are bridged through corridors, and some species within that community will bridge through those corridors and link to the community as a whole, which is termed as the meta-community. Throughout time, landscape will change and boundaries will change. Species composition will change and alter the community structure, which is the result of disturbances.
Today, I will be discussing about the ecological issues and applications. Many nature reserves, wilderness habitats, and national parks are established to protect the areas. However, most of the protected areas cover a small area of land which can only support smaller species, since larger areas are needed to maintain larger species. There's an approach used in conservation efforts. The use of corridors is an approach to connect or link existing isolated protected areas into one large system. The purpose of these corridors is to facilitate the migration and dispersal of animals from a protected area to another. Another way of making habitat corridors is by removing the barriers, such as a road or a fence. These barriers can limit the animal movement and give rise to animal mortality as they cross those barriers. That's why wildlife overpasses and underpasses are made so that these animals can safely cross the road. Also, the establishment of corridors aimed to support viable population.